Welcome back to the channel everyone, and in this video we're going to combine two of my favourite pastimes, which is whiskey and books. Well, we're not going to be doing any drinking of whiskey on this video, which we never do in this channel. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about histories, we talk about investing, we talk about collecting. And in this video, we're going to run down 10 of my favourite books that I think pretty much everyone should own, and the ones that I've got in my library. Now, the first one that we're starting off with today is this. It is called Independent Scotch, and it is by a chap called David Stirk. It's about 25 quid, and if you only go out and buy one book on this list, I would say this would be the one that I would say go out and buy, because it's so important. Now, what's the book about? Well, it says it on the cover here, really. The history of independent bottlers. Now, David Stirk's got an interesting and varied career, which he talks about in the first 2/3 of the book. He worked for the SMWS for a decent period of time, worked over with Carden Heads as well. And there's some really interesting, fascinating stories in there about his time at those companies. But what the really good part of this book is, where are we? Towards the end of the book, you've got like a directory of independent bottlers. Now, as far as I'm aware, I don't think there's a better or as well compiled list of independent bottlers out there, and it kind of gives you a really nice, interesting rundown of all of the bottlers, their histories, and some interviews with some of the people that make these companies tick. Now, its USP is that it's a really in-depth history of independent bottlers written by somebody who was and is an independent bottler. Now, it's suited to anybody really. Like, some of these books are only for the super niche. This one, I would say no, it's not suited to anybody. I would say it's suited to people with a mid to serious level of interest in collecting whiskey, and this will just be invaluable because look at what's coming out from the distilleries at the moment. It's utter basically garbage being regurgitated again and again and again. The new distilleries are releasing new bottlings which aren't really that exciting. The older and established distilleries, Macallan for instance, what are they releasing? It's of note recently. Everything is just being delayed and again, delayed. But if you look at independent bottlers, they put out some sensational whiskies. And to be fair, I think that the independent bottlers is where the value lies in the market. So this is a real must buy if you're into collecting and investing in whiskey. And it is the first one that you should go and buy if you are serious about whiskey. Now, the next one, that was £25. The next one is a decent step up, but it's probably, as you'll see, let me show you the spine of the book first. Can you see that? It's absolutely battered, this book. This is Collecting Scotch Whisky by Emmanuel Dron, and it contains over 2,500 bottles, 12,500 photographs spread across nearly 1,000 pages, and it must weigh close to 5 kilos. It's an absolute monster of the book. And the book is essentially like it's formed in several parts really. The start of the book, it's essentially like a reference work or a reference of all the bottles that have ever been released through the 20th century. Not all of them, but pretty much most of them are going to be in here. So you start off at the start of the book with some of the independent bottlers. So for instance, there we've just stumbled on John and Wallace Milroy. Of course, they did the fantastic Balvenie 50-year-old. But you also get the Samaroli there. And it's pretty much every bottle that has ever been released is going to be listed in here. And then at the back, or towards the back of the book, you have all the distillery released bottlings. So here's the Lafroig page. It's really hard to hold this one up. Lafroig page, for instance. And then, of course, right at the very back, you've got some really interesting interviews with some big and important collectors. Now, this is the definitive reference book on collecting bottles of whiskey. It's called Collecting Scotch Whisky. There might be a part 2 coming out which covers bottles from the 21st century, but at the moment it's just this one and it's about 300 quid. But it's a really invaluable book, and it's not without its flaws. It doesn't really tell you too much information. You might sort of find the bottle that you're looking for and then not be able to find much more about it. But the key is that it's kind of like a visual reference of all of these bottles. So if you've got a bottle and you're trying to identify it, it's almost certainly going to be in here. The abuse that this book has taken is testimony to how much use it gets from us in the office. So this is one of our most used books, but it's £310. It's only for really serious collectors. And I think there's a reprint of it at the moment at Royal Mail Whiskies. But if you're looking for a book that covers pretty much everything that you want to know about bottles of whiskey, when they were released, the release dates, about the history and development of corks, this, that, and the other, that is the book for you. So it's really, really, really worth that £310 purchase price. Now, the next one, what have we got on here? Let me pick it up off the floor. The next one is this. It's the Malt Whisky Yearbook by Ingvar Ronde. Now, this is now in the 19th edition, and we've got all 19 of them in the office. And it's one of these books that if you speak to pretty much anybody in the whiskey industry, they'll have every book of this. They'll have, you know, from when their interest in whiskey first started, they'll probably have every edition that has been released. It's only £15.95, so it's cheap enough for every year to just go and pick up the new one from Amazon or somewhere like that and get it delivered to the door. Now, what is it about? Well, the book's broken down into several parts. The front of the book is some really interesting articles in here by some sort of, should we say, titans of the industry, or sort of pretty well-respected people in the industry. And then the second part, or the chunk of the volume is, you know, so let's pick up here. Here's a page for you. And this has now got a history of the distillery and some basic changes that have been happening since the last edition was published. And you've also got a really helpful, let's see if we'll focus on that, a really helpful timeline, which if you're ever writing articles or filming YouTube videos and you're going to go, oh my God, when was the Altmore distillery founded? Well, it was founded in 1896 by Alexander Edward, owner of the Benrinnes distillery. So it's a really handy book just to pick up, dive in and out of. There's really interesting sales figures here. And here's ones that will probably surprise some of you here. That is the top 30 whiskies of the world. And you get down to number 5 before you get down to Johnnie Walker, because the top 4 spots outstrip Johnnie Walker several to one, and they're all Indian whiskies. And that is something that we're going to be taking a look at in more detail on this channel to come. So if you're new to the channel, welcome, subscribe, whatever. We talk about collecting and investing whiskey and loads of interesting stuff in between, but we don't really do tasting notes, I'm afraid. But anyway, this is a book it's not for everybody. It's, if you've got a passive to mid-level interest in collecting whiskey, then this will be a really helpful book. The histories and the abridgedness of the histories makes it really easy to dip into this book. You've just bought a new bottle at auction. Fantastic. Let's learn a bit more about the distillery. You pick this book up and you can just dip into the history of the distillery very easily, rather than going online and finding some disconnected history of that distillery. So really well recommended, £15, so it's pretty affordable. So everyone should go out there and buy it. Now, the next one on my list is, it's this. It's a beautiful looking book. It is Everything You Need to Know About Whiskey by Nicholas Morgan and the Whisky Exchange. It's about £20. And I would say this is probably one of the best £20 that you will spend. I mean, our library in the office here, we've got hundreds of books on whiskey, and to try and narrow it down to 10 is pretty difficult. But putting this book in the list was a no-brainer really, because there aren't many books that are genuinely well written. There are a lot of whiskey enthusiasts who write books, and they're perhaps not the best at telling that story. They're just telling that story because they happen to know so much about the subject. This is a book that covers a lot of different subjects, from investing in casks to sort of how whiskey's made, the history of Irish whiskey, and all sorts that you need to know. And it's really beautifully illustrated throughout. Now, let's have a look here. You see, it's just got beautiful illustrations, and it really is the book that, it's not the sort of book that you'd ever read cover to cover, don't get me wrong, but it's the sort of book that you can pick up, read the chapter and go, well, you know what, I got 2 or 3 decent points out of that. It's a good book if you're looking to buy, if you're trying to find someone as a whiskey gift. This is a perfect gift for a whiskey lover, because no matter who you buy it for, they will find something good in here to read. And let's just come to the introduction here. How whiskey is made, whiskey experts and expertise. There is no such thing as experts. Whiskey collectors and collecting, whiskey and food, whiskey and freedom, whiskey and popular culture, whiskey people, the business of whiskey and drinking whiskey. It really is a jack of all trades, and there are lots of books that try and be a jack of all trades, but don't. And this is where this book succeeds. So for 20 quid, go and get this one bought. Now, we're jumping up the notches here, and before I show you the book, look at this bloody dog-eaten corner. Because when we've got a little whippet in the office, our little dog called Percy. When he was younger, he decided to take a fancy to this book when I left it at home after leaving it on the sofa. And it's a bloody expensive book. This is the definitive guide to buying vintage Macallan, and it is £300. We've got some of these for sale on our shop, so if you're looking to buy old and rare whiskies and old and rare books, head to the Mark Littler shop. Now, this is a really important book. It's beautifully illustrated. We could probably do a whole video on this book, to be fair, but here you can see this. The reason that this book was released was because it was to coincide with the release of the Fine and Rare collection. So in here, you will find details about every single Fine and Rare collection bottling. And there are two versions of this book, actually, even though they're both first editions, there are two versions. This one here, you can see the Macallan 1926 Fine and Rare. This one doesn't have a price on it, but in the other copies, it does have the RRP of each bottle printed here. So in 2001, you could have walked up, you can tell I'm filming in the new office, can't you? You can walk up to the distillery with £20,000 and you could have gone and bought a Macallan 1926 Fine and Rare, the bottle that sold for £1.5 million a couple of years ago. So there's a lot of information in this book, and the key point, the most important thing about this to me is that it's come straight from source. So all of the information in here is direct from Macallan. So you know that if they say it's right, it's probably going to be right, except there are a few exceptions, because in the back here, we do talk about the Macallan replica series, because there was a problem with the replica series, wasn't there, in terms of they weren't what Macallan said they were. They turned out to be fake. So they based this whole replica series, or most of the replica series, based on fake whiskey. But anyway, that's a subject for another day potentially, but it is a really interesting book because it gives you details about some of the most iconic bottles that have ever been made. There's the history of all the most expensive Macallans sold at auction up until the point that the book was published. But it's about 300 quid. It isn't cheap, but if you're a die-hard Macallan collector, you know what? What can you get for 300 quid from Macallan? You can't even buy an 18-year-old. So go and buy that book instead and give your head something to nourish and enjoy. Now, next one. We're kind of going back in time a bit now. I would love to buy a first edition of this book. So if anybody watching this has got a genuine first edition of this book, let me know. Get in touch, get in the comments, because I'd really like to buy one of these first editions. And that is, of course, you can't really see it here, it's the Whiskey Distilleries of the United Kingdom by Alfred Barnard. This is a reprint. As you can see, I take a lot of the dust jackets off books. They really annoy me, but who cares? And this is a reprint from the original book from around 1887. Now, Alfred Barnard set on a noble quest. He was a writer for Harper's Weekly Gazette, and at the end of the 19th century, he decided nobody has ever visited every single distillery in the United Kingdom, and I'm going to do that. So props to him, he did it. He went around the entire United Kingdom at the end of the 19th century, which would have been no mean feat, and he set out and he was sort of writing these notes and histories and anecdotes about the distilleries, and they were eventually compiled and put into this book. Now, it's a really interesting snapshot of the whiskey industry 136 years ago. Let me just do one thing. Let's find the page on the Macallan distillery, if I can. Let's see. Macallan. Oh, it's not done in any logical order. Well, it's not done alphabetically, it is in a logical order. Let me just find the Macallan. It's a bloody page 197. And bear with me on this, because this is interesting. 195, 196, 197. There, in its entirety, here, just this little bit here, is the history or the details that he wrote about Macallan or the Macallan distillery. Very, very small, because Macallan was not at that point. Let's take a look at this one. The Glen Grant distillery. So you've got all of this. You've got some beautiful illustrations here as well. And it kind of goes into a heck of a lot of detail describing the distillery and their practices. But again, it isn't a fun read. It's not necessarily an easy read, but it's an important read. If you want to understand where we are now, you have to understand where we've come from. And this is the book that can do that. And there's not many other books from the 19th century that will do that in such a good way. Now, it really is suited to hardcore whiskey enthusiasts and whiskey nerds, but for about 40 quid, if you can get a reprint like this, you can get cheaper reprints as well. It really is worth having, and yeah, enjoy it while you're having a dram, but don't sit down and read it at bedtime because it will just, well, you won't get very far before you go to sleep. Now, we mentioned in this book, the Malt Whisky Yearbook, how Johnnie Walker is the 5th best-selling whiskey brand in the world, and it is for that reason that this book is next on our list. It's called Johnnie Walker: A Long Stride, the story of the world's #1 Scotch, and again, it's by Nicholas Morgan. It's about 16, 17 pounds, and it is a good book. It's not a great book, it's a good book, and it's an important book as well because it documents the history of Johnnie Walker from the turn of the 19th century through the 20th century and to pretty much where we are now. As you can see with all of my notes here, can you see all those little sticky notes here? I found this book really useful when we were filming and researching the Johnnie Walker videos that we did on this channel, and we've still got a few more of those to come. And it really is a good in-depth, and I mean in-depth, look at the history of Johnnie Walker and how the brand developed, how the advertising developed. And the only criticism that I've got of this book is that it doesn't do enough to the present day. It doesn't talk enough about, say, the introduction of the blue label. It's mentioned, but only very much in passing. Now, it's not like reading, but without Johnnie Walker, I think it's pretty fair to say that we wouldn't have single malt Scotch whisky, because without Johnnie Walker keeping all of those distilleries alive and going and being active, you know, where would they be now? They wouldn't have been able to sell all their output of single malt Scotch whisky. They even nowadays sell very little percentage-wise of what they produce as single malt Scotch whisky. A lot of it goes into blends. And what's the most important blend of the 20th century and 21st century, arguably? Johnnie Walker. So it's a great book. Buy it, but I would put others ahead of it on the list, but Johnnie Walker is so important that to have a good understanding of that is important. Now, the next one is so good, I've not even got it here because it's at home, because it's just a book that I enjoy dipping in and out of, and I'll put a picture of it on the screen now, and it's called The Philosophy of Whisky by Billy Abbott. It's a tenner. Seriously, stop what you're doing. Well, yeah, stop this video. Go and buy this book for £10 because you won't regret it. It's part of the British Museum's Philosophy of series. There's all sorts of Philosophy of series, and it's the perfect introduction to whiskey. Now, the USP on this book, it's a super friendly, well-written read about whiskey. It covers all sorts. There's loads of sort of little anecdotes and stories in here about the foundation of Jack Daniels and all sorts of world whiskies, and a brief overviews of such big topics like how is whiskey made. But I don't think very many books do it as well as Billy's book, because he writes it in such a way that it's engaging and it's fun, and you can kind of pick it up and read it just like a real book, not a boring whiskey book. It actually reads like a good, fun whiskey book. You can buy it for anyone. It's suited to newbies. If you're a very well-established whiskey reader or a drinker, whatever, it is a really good book just to pick up, read a chapter at a time, and put it down again. I even took it on holiday to read with me, and it is a really good book. Now, next on the list, so sorry, Billy, I forgot to bring your book into the office for this one, but anyway, we're moving on to this, A Passion for Whisky by Ian Wisniewski. I probably pronounced that wrong, but it's £25, I can pronounce the price, and it is titled How the Tiny Scottish Island of Islay Creates Malts That Captivate the World. So what it's about all the Scotch whisky distilleries on Islay. Well, you say that because, and this is it's not to put you off it, but let's see here. Is that the start? This portion of the book here is dedicated to the distilleries of Islay. This portion of the book here, so a good third of it, and the opening third of it, is about how whiskey is made and how whiskey tastes and this, that, and the other. And there's nothing wrong with that, but when you're packaging a book called A Passion for Whisky and a book about Islay whiskies, I'd say let's focus on the Islay distilleries first of all, and the Islay whiskies first, and then put how whiskey is made and all the tasting stuff at the back or in an appendix or whatever. But that said, why is it in this list if I'm criticizing it like that? Because you know what? It's really nicely written. The distillery histories are brief, but long enough to keep you interested. They're slightly longer than the ones that you'll find in the Malt Whisky Yearbook, but they are not as in-depth as you'll find if you bought a specific book. But there's loads of interesting anecdotes and snapshots of the distillery's progression through history, and it's really good. And it's probably quite a good book for gifting as well. It's a sort of book that you can buy for people that love Islay whiskey, but you don't know which one to buy them. Buy them this book. Do you know that they like Islay whiskey? Yes or no? No, doesn't matter. People will love the distilleries and learning about the distilleries that are mentioned in this book. And it really is a good book. And you know what? It's a really beautifully illustrated book as well. So it looks quite nice on your coffee table as well. Now, we move into the bad boy, the big boy. If you have got any money left to spend at the end of this video and you want to go and spend £450 on probably the least well-written, most boring book in this entire list, then buy this one. And what is it? It is this. It's a Scotch Whisky Industry Review. It is. What is it? Well, I'm going to read my notes here. It's a detailed data analysis and history covering everything from visitor centre attendance, expansions in malt distilling capacity and fiscal duty ratios. It's basically an almanac of so this is this page here that we've just stopped on. This is increases in malt distilling capacity from 2012 to 2013. 2014, 2015, and it will just have all the data that you would ever not need to know about a distillery unless you were really seriously interested about writing about whiskey like we are in this business. And there isn't any other book that will get you this level of macro data that's out there on the market. This is the 2022 edition, and they're kind of issued a year in arrears. So in 2023, this was released in 2023, but it has the 2022 figures. So the book that's going to be released in 2024 will have the 2023 figures. Some people read a little bit too much into this data as well. So I think you have to take a pinch of salt with some of the data here, because one of the most interesting things in here is bottled malt case sales estimates. So let's pick a producer. Let's pick the Edrington Group. So Highland Park, UK, 39,220 cases. Export market, 131,655 cases. Macallan, 36,050 domestic cases, 866,880 export cases. Now, even if you don't believe these numbers and take them for exactly what they are, they're not exactly going to reveal the exact sales volumes and values that they're having. It is a really good way to figure out how much of a distillery's capacity is UK based and how much of it is overseas based, because we tend to think, we're based in the UK. A lot of people in the UK tend to think that we are the biggest consumers of Scotch whisky. Nonsense, it's the rest of the world. And books like this really do, look at this, number of visitors to the visitor centres. So I'll pick a distillery, Dalmore. Whoever said Dalmore, thank you very much. Dalmore, in 2019 had 5,800 visitors, and they didn't record their visitor numbers in 2020 or 2021. Let's go up to some of the ones that you might find unusual. Aberfeldy in 2021 had 19,618. Let's see if Macallan is on here, because they had their new distillery opened in 2018, and in 2017 and 2016 and 2015 they were averaging about 20,000. 2018, 35,000 visitors. 2019, 55,000 visitors. So there you go. You're not going to find that information anywhere else except in a very boring niche book like that. So there you go. There's 10 books. And if you really want to improve your learning about whiskey, get all of those books purchased. Yes, it will cost you a lot of money, but you will definitely be a wiser investor and collector at the end of it.